Okay, class, today we're going to talk about rhombus, and a rhombus is another version of a parallelogram, like a rectangle was a type of parallelogram. So it has some similar features. Just like a parallelogram, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, so AB is going to be parallel to CD, and AC is going to be parallel to BD. The biggest difference between a rhombus and a parallelogram is that a rhombus has to have all four sides be congruent. So think of it as a square that's been slanted slightly. Whereas a parallelogram, it did not have to be the case. Parallelograms could have opposite sides. Well, their opposite sides were congruent, but all four did not have to be the same. In this case, they do. So that means AB equals CD equals AC equals BD. All four sides are the same. But just like a parallelogram, because it's slanted, the opposite angles are going to be congruent. So A is going to be congruent to D, and C is going to be congruent to B. But obviously B and C are acute and A and D are obtuse, so the red angles are not congruent to the green angles. Okay? And just like a parallelogram and a rectangle, consecutive angles are supplementary. So A and C are consecutive, so they add up to 180. A and B are consecutive, so they add up to 180. B and D are consecutive, and D and C are consecutive. All four sets of those are supplementary, which means they add up to 180 degrees. Now, just like a rectangle and a parallelogram, we're going to talk about the diagonals of a rhombus. So we'll first look. We have our two diagonals here, and they intersect at point E. Okay? And the first thing we need to know about the diagonals is they are not congruent. Okay, so in a parallelogram they were not congruent. In a rectangle they were congruent, but this time they are not congruent. And here's the main reason. Just like a parallelogram, because all four angles are not congruent, since A is not congruent to C, and C is not congruent to D, and D is not congruent to B, since these are all different angles, the diagonals cannot be congruent. In this case, since A is obtuse and C is acute, then that's going to make BC my larger diagonal because it's opposite that obtuse angle. Okay, whereas AD is opposite that acute angle, it's going to be smaller. So CB is bigger than AD. Okay? And just like in our previous two shapes, parallelogram and rectangle, the diagonals do bisect each other. But since they are not congruent, then we are going to have some different pieces. So AE is going to be congruent to ED, and BE is going to be congruent to EC. Okay? Now, the different thing about a rhombus that is unique to rhombus, and it is not like a rectangle or a parallelogram, is that since all four sides are congruent, the diagonals bisect the angles. And what I mean by that is this diagonal is bisecting C and it's bisecting B. So these four angles that we have here, shown with these red stars, are all going to be the same thing. And at the same time, AD is bisecting angle A and bisecting angle D. So these four green stars represent the four congruent angles that we have there. So that wraps up our rhombus section. We'll do some practice with this tomorrow in class.